Have you ever had a handshake that was just the worst? Like maybe it was cold or limp or wet for some reason? Well, if you've lived on this earth long enough and have met fellow human beings, you've probably experienced a handshake. Handshakes are a pretty integral part of our culture, from job interviews and politics to pop culture and sports. Handshakes can be seen in all different shapes and sizes and in all different forms and situations. Due to recent events, the handshake is rapidly declining. So first, let's grasp onto what a handshake really is. Secondly, we'll reach back to the history of the handshake. And finally, put our finger on why we need the handshake, but also why we should be careful. So first off, what is a handshake? Well, I don't think I have to explain a handshake in its simplest form, but just in case you haven't seen another human in the past year, a handshake is simply defined as two hands coming together as a peaceful sign of greeting, agreement, or farewell. But there are a few different types of handshakes, and to illustrate this, picture with me it's the year 2017. At this time, I was in middle school. The worst 7 years of my life, which I'm told was actually only 2 years, but I don't buy it. Like in all places, you have the cool kids walking down the halls talking about how many touchdowns LeBron James made in his last tennis match. But what was the most defining feature of these 13-year-old prime specimen? It was the way they greeted each other. They always had the coolest handshakes, and even if they were simple, only the cool kids seemed to do them, and everyone else lower down on the food chain just seemed to watch in awe. This demonstrates just how powerful a handshake can be, both to the participant and even to the spectator. But like I said, there are a few different types. And just in case you're unfamiliar with the different types of handshakes, let me explain and demonstrate a few of them. However, since, I don't know if you've noticed, but you cannot shake your own hand, I purchased one. And it's a lot smaller than it looked like on the Amazon description. So our first handshake is the classic. This is the tried and true church to soccer tryout shake, and though it's seen a huge decline in recent years, it goes all the way back to ancient Rome, and is still the most commonly thought of when one mentions the handshake. It is, or was, the standard for job interviews and business deals, although there are a few variations that can be seen, such as grabbing the forearm in order to express dominance or something, or using two hands in order to make the other person as uncomfortable as physically possible. Gloves are recommended if you'd like to try one of these nowadays. Our second handshake is the dap. The dap is like the classic, but rotated 90 degrees. It's a more recent development, originating from black soldiers in the Vietnam War. There is so much more to the dap than I have time to talk about today, but it is one of the truest forms of respect in informal situations, and especially in black culture. So careful not to overuse it. Our third handshake pushes the definition a bit. I guess it's more of an honorable mention, but it's the fist bump. I mention it because it's becoming exceedingly more prevalent in today's society, especially because of the ability to not touch all the parts of your hand you use to touch your face and blow your nose. And the fist bump originates from boxers bumping gloves before a match and was normalized as an alternative to the handshake. Expect to see this form of greeting a lot more in the not so distant future. So at this point, you're probably wondering, where in the world did the handshake come from? Why do people vigorously grab each other's hands and move them up and down? Well, there's one main idea that the handshake has carried all throughout history, and that's the idea of peace. Megan Garber, writer for The Atlantic, tells us that handshakes, historically, have been invoked as a sign of easy equality, a hope for a friction-free world. Its mathematical simplicity, hand to hand, flesh to flesh, implies the dissolution of the differences that may otherwise separate one person from another. So with this idea of peace in mind, there are two basic periods of history that the handshake has been through. Firstly, we have the origin. According to National Geographic, the handshake goes back over 3,000 years ago to Mediterranean culture, where ancient carvings depict soldiers, kings, and even gods shaking hands. But this was a form of peacemaking or agreement, and not as a simple hello or goodbye as we see it today. On the other hand, men in ancient Rome would grab each other's forearms in order to make sure that the other person was not hiding a weapon up their sleeve. And the shake part was simply to shake free any loose hidden weapons. Sounds like a lack of trust to me, but it was still a form of equality and peacemaking between two people. In this period of time, the handshake was only done between friends and was seen as a very inappropriate thing to do between strangers. That obviously has changed, however, and that brings us to the second period of the handshake, the rise of the modern shake. How did we start grabbing each other's hands in greeting? Well, this is usually credited to the Quakers, who, according to mentalfloss.com, in order to show equality with one another, would shake hands as a form of hello or goodbye. This was really uncommon at the time in Europe, as the most popular forms of greeting were the bow for those of higher social standing, or the kiss on the cheek, which was for just friends. If only. To most people, the handshake was seen as a vile English tradition. And like most European things that they don't like, it made its way to the Americas and soon was being used by colonists for both business and even informal uses. But it still took a while for the handshake to reach all areas of American life. President George Washington preferred to bow instead of shaking hands. But Thomas Jefferson was the first president to start shaking hands with not only his fellow politicians, but also with civilians. And this set a precedent of handshaking in political office, and up until this past year, a refusal to shake hands in politics is seen as a great disrespect. So that brings us to the handshake today, or like a year ago today, as a simple greeting between both friends and even strangers. But the handshake is said by many people to soon lose its grip on American culture forever. So what's happening to the handshake? Why is it dangerous? Why is it needed? Well, other cultures seem to get away with not touching each other just fine, such as bowing in Asian culture. So why, here in America, do we get so up in arms about the need to touch each other? I mean, it's sort of nasty. You don't know where that person's hands have been. They could have licked every inch of that thing, and you're touching all of it. But that brings up another important point that the handshake has, and that's the idea of trust. Behavioral scientist Val Curtis of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine says that one possible reason that handshakes and kisses on the cheeks have endured as greetings is because it shows that the other person is trusted enough to risk sharing germs with. Now, obviously, if you see someone lick their hand, it would be understandable to not want to then shake it. But trust is sort of lacking in today's culture. Maybe for good reason, but the handshake is one of the lasting relics of common trust here in America. Now, don't worry, I didn't forget about the global pandemic that's plagued our world for more than half a year now. Obviously, shaking hands in today's climate is maybe not the wisest thing to do, both for the health of you and for others. But to say that the handshake will never come back, I feel like is a bit of a reach. Handshakes have been put on pause before due to public health concerns in the past, such as the swine flu in the early 1900s, or even as recent as 2009. Now, above all, we should remember where the handshake came from. As a simple sign of equality and agreement and peacemaking between two people. The handshake was created for others. So we should be careful when greeting one another to promote the general welfare of those we're greeting. So today we've gone over what a handshake is, including a few different types. We've explored the history of the handshake, and we've touched on the implications, or lack thereof, in today's culture. I'm sure we've all had some awful handshakes in our lives, but I, for one, this past year have really missed the connection and familiarity the handshake brings to our dog eat dog, every man for himself world. We live in a society that's a chasm of polarity and division, and we're hanging on the edge. We can't lose our grip.